All right. So we can do brief introductions first, and then we can get started. So I'm Zach. I use Zach Whistler, they them pronouns. I'll be the PMC for Trinity on the Gov, and I'll take verbal POIs.
And I'm North Kylie, she, her pronouns, and I'll be second speaker for Trinity on the show.
Well, my mom just got home, so I'm actually going to give her a chance to walk by before I start the speech, so she doesn't walk by in the middle. Finals.
Oh, you're 5 minutes. I love you. I love you.
Okay. Okay. So sorry about that. Okay, are we ready? My time. Oh, my timer. My time will start now. We are the first generation that can feel the effects of climate change, but the last that can actually do something about it. It is for this reason that we are so proud to propose this resolution. A few things in this speech. We'll be doing some top of case definitions, frameworks, but then we're going to do a fair amount of like observations and modeling for not only what the resolution should look like, but what kind of the rest of this debate should look like before we get into contentions of our own. We're going to obviously, I think the resolution is kind of like pretty clear. Like this house is going to be like a rational actor, but I think we have like a very clear definition of what this plan or policy would like actually look like, so we can have a clear stasis point for this debate. So what Nora and our advocacy is that this is exclusively going to be for politicians that are alive, and it should happen specifically in the area of the disaster. So let's say a hurricane were to hit New York, it would be fine to name that like Hurricane Donald Trump. He's from New York, or I guess for America it would be fine for Donald Trump, but for specifically for like senators, it should be in the area from which they are. And we think it's only people that currently believe these things, just because of the word "are" in the resolution, because that are against combating climate change. So we're not putting in senators that are like already dead or politicians that passed years ago. And we're not doing people that have like changed their minds because they don't actively combat climate change. Insofar as that's the case, if someone changes their mind, we would also take their name off of the national disaster. With that, one more observation about like every single impact in this round. We're going to be very clear that it's pretty tiny. Like no one on either side is going to be solving climate change. We think like the biggest impact you can probably try to grab is like bullying the politician enough so like they change their mind or like they'd quit or like something happens to them. But this is not like a massive big picture solving every single problem in society. And you shouldn't let like either team get away with that. With that, our first contention is going to be
POC stop the time.
Yep.
So just in the case that someone does change their mind and they get their name taken off, what is the naming scheme then for the hurricane? Do you just go to a different politician or just go to like something else?
I feel like we can go to a different politician. Yeah, just keep bullying people. Okay, time will continue now. Contention one is going to be backlash. We have two warrants for this. The first is going to be about the spotlight, which is going to be the second you do this, this politician is going to be put on blast for their political opinions and put out to the entire world, right? What does this really look like in practice? A lot of people that are against combating climate change are not really open about the fact that they're against combating climate change. They have money from big donors, they vote against key bills, but they're not screaming climate change is fake. That's like the very small vocal minority. So what we say is that when we put these politicians on blast, we put them in the spotlight, you name a natural disaster after them. Let's say the entire media picks this up for a little bit. They're like a national joke. People are laughing at them. All the kids think it's funny. It goes viral on Twitter, whatever. At the very least, this politician is like in the spotlight and their opinions are being shown. We anticipate like a response for this is going to be about like platforming these figures. So we just kind of like want to get ahead of that and say that it's a kind of a silly argument because these are all politicians. Like their whole job is to have a platform and be elected. I don't think we can platform a politician or specifically an elected official more than they already are as the leader of a country. And then even besides that, we would say, sure, platform her. Then she can explain why like the coal money in her pocket's like more important than like her citizens' lives. So I feel like at the end of that day, that's not really that wouldn't stand. And then this next warrant here is about people that are like actually affected by the said like event. If like Hurricane Rick Perry hit Florida, I don't know how the citizens of Florida would react like 100% because they're a little bit interesting. But I would say an average person would probably not be the biggest fan of Rick Perry after that event. Like if Hurricane Donald Trump hit me, or let's say like a wildfire that was named after my current state senator who is against climate change, that builds resentment subconsciously. Even if you think that like, oh, it's just the name of the hurricane, it's fundamental subliminal like associations between that name and that event. People don't like to think of this. You see this empirically with like drops in the like people being named Katrina after 2002, right? Like although obviously just like the name of a hurricane, it's pretty important just like symbolically. Then what are like the impacts of this? We'll give you two possible impacts. First, the politician can like change their opinions, and that would kind of like solve the entire problem. They would stop voting against it. Or we would say that they kind of just like leave. They don't change their opinions, they get clowned on. And like look at like they may quit a la like Millie Bobby Brown when she left social media because she was getting clowned on for homophobia. But like this time they're actually doing the thing. So I think the impact would be a little bit more intense. Second contention is going to be about discourse. What we would say is that fundamentally this increases the discourse about climate change. I would say in the status quo, people are like pretty over it already, especially in the mainstream. When you say like energy, people are more focused about like the gas prices than they are about switching to renewable energy for your average person. So I think constantly having like every time a natural disaster comes up to be like, oh, climate change, look at this senator. It like gives like a little burst in the media for people to kind of focus back and increase discourse about the conversation in general. A great warrant here is like last year we had a PF topic that was about like high-speed rail, and one person started off the year by calling like Joe Manchin a climate terrorist, and then like half of the arguments on the rest of the topic were about like climate terrorist Joe Manchin. It was a very small topic area, but we all kind of thought it was funny to call him a climate terrorist. So we ended up talking about climate change even more than we usually would have. So I think that's like a really interesting thing. Maybe we'll end up holding on to things that are like kind of funny, kind of quirky, and are outside of like the status quo. Because you may think that this is a silly argument, but when earthquake Donald Trump like destroys your home, you're going to find a tiny bit of humor in just the pure absurdity of the event and the fact that it's named after a person in like the cultural zeitgeist. Our last connection is going to be accepted.
Yeah, when a hurricane destroys your home, do you usually find it funny?
I think that in the actual absurdity of the situation of, let's say, Hurricane Rick Perry, not only would it be to a certain extent comical for people outside of the situation. This is not my point about individual backlash. This is the point about societal discourse. And the people inside the situation, I already have a talk that they would like be fucking furious at Rick Perry. And then that would like generate sort of like negativity in hindsight, right? So it's kind of like different interactions for different groups of society. Our third argument is going to be about like recentering the topic. And we would say that people are really disconnected to climate change because when people think of it, it's like massive holes in the ozone layer or like global warming that's happening over 100 years. People like don't like to think about it. People push it away. However, when we recenter the discourse by saying no, natural disasters are climate change and these politicians are the one causing it, not only do we say no, this applies to you in your everyday life because everyone has been through a hurricane. People see natural disasters. If you live in California, you get earthquakes every so often. That's just kind of how it goes. But fundamentally, if people are making it worse, if they're doing more fracking on fault lines, if they're increasing pollution, increasing global warming, these events become more often. However, that association is not often made. This means that every single time a natural disaster goes on, that association is made not only once, but on every news network, every time that a natural disaster is talked about. It is no longer Hurricane Irene, it is now Hurricane who in New York is against climate change? Hurricane John Koch. He's not even a politician, but he spends enough money. I mean, fundamentally, at the end of the day, the point is we need to be calling attention to these issues that are currently either not being talked about, or when they are talked about, they're talked about in a way that allows them to be ignored. The second you end up talking about the slight variations in the degrees Celsius over the next 200 years, you lose half of the American populace and half the opinions you need. When you talk about an event that devastates lives, you have connections. You know who you're affecting. And for all of these reasons, I strongly urge already a Gov ballot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, PM. And now I call upon the LO for a speech not exceeding 8 minutes, 30-second grace.
Oh. And time starts now. I strongly negate the motion. Just starting on top of case, we didn't see a weighing mechanism. It should just be util. I think this is pretty intuitive. Moving over to opposition case, we would like to present a counterfactual or counterplan. We think that instead of being named after politicians, natural disasters and extreme weather events in the future should instead be named after major corporations that are heavily contributing to climate change and environmental destruction. We think that similar to politicians, it would be especially corporations that are relevant to whatever locale the group hit in. Yeah, so like, I don't know, if it was a hurricane that hit Brazil, we think this would probably be named after like some major corporation in Brazil. I don't really know that many corporations in Brazil, but you get the point, I think. Okay. Yeah. And then major corporations are just like large corporations. Heavily contributing means making a significant impact. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the scale of like Amazon. We think that like a specific mining company within that region that is contributing to large scale like climate change and environmental destruction within that region, we think that is also like large enough of an impact to apply. Okay, so our first contention is that we think naming these weather events after the corporations instead of politicians creates more direct action. Subpoint A is that companies are able to actually create more change than politicians. For example, like a corporation can literally just be, we will now have better practices and do less pollution. I will take it later if I have time, right? This is especially like relevant to so many corporations that just like do not do any work to try to clean up any environmental damage they do. They do not do any work to try to make sure that their like factories are the most environmentally efficient. Like these are really easy for the CEO and the board to be like, we're now just going to change these practices. Comparatively, politicians just don't have that much power. First of all, they're just one person within a system of many politicians, the most of which are still going to have the same opinions. And also, like, politicians are bought out by these companies, even if the politician changes their mind, at the point where like their campaigns are funded by groups like Shell, by groups like Amazon, they can't really make they can't make any legislation against this without literally losing support. We think they're going to prioritize that over like being the national joke. Subpoint B is the population has more control over companies than over politicians. So we'll get to this more on the Gov case, but like assuming that people are going to dislike politicians, dislike companies because of this, we think that because politicians are only beholden to their specific constituents, while companies are beholden to like the world at large, all people in the world have power over companies, only some people have power over politicians, there's more ability for change. Yeah, okay. And then, so what does this mean functionally? We think that companies will get a ton of bad PR from this, and they will do one of two things. One, they will probably change their practices entirely, right? They don't want to be the national joke. They don't want like people to be at them. I'll take it after the contention if I have time. And so we think they're going to change their practice. Second, even if they don't change their practices, they're still going to do something to offset bad PR. Generally, what this looks like when some person or company gets slammed for doing something really bad is they make a really large donation to like some organization that is trying to fix this issue. So we say that even if like Amazon didn't necessarily change their practices, we think they would still like make a really big donation to like some group trying to save some environmental thing. We think on net, either way, they're going to do something to stop the bad PR. I'll take your POI now.
Haven't companies with like huge like emissions been facing backlash for like quite literally years? Like, why have they not done anything to like change this? They care so much.
They don't, because they only face backlash from like certain like very small groups of liberals in certain areas. The point is that now when like people in Florida have connected in their minds their homes getting destroyed to companies like Shell, they will care more people will care, and this is why it will matter, instead of like just liberals from New York and Berkeley caring. Second is that companies are relevant for longer. So like just this is kind of true. Companies stay around for a really long time. Comparatively, politicians don't. Supreme Court justices maybe do, but every other politician in our country has a term limit. They're not going to stay around forever. What does this mean? It's not relevant for as long. So, for example, if like some hurricane is named after Mitch McConnell, and then Mitch McConnell gets voted out in 2 years, this becomes completely irrelevant to future people. Comparatively, if it's named after, for example, Shell, then people forever, as long as Shell exists, which is going to be a lot longer, will still have this bad perception of Shell. That will matter longer overall. And so people will continue to be mad at this company for a really long amount of time, compared to politicians, where people will stop caring as soon as the politician gets voted out of office. And so again, there's more impact on our side of the house. third contention here is that it's really hard to be named after a hurricane or natural disaster. Politicians have human names. Other humans also have human names. I am named Amber. Ever since the Amber Heard trials, I have been teased for being named Amber, like relentlessly by everyone. I also get teased for being, because the Amber Alert is also named after a person named Amber. We think that it's really annoying and also like can be genuinely really frustrating and traumatizing and like harmful to a person's education if they're constantly getting bullied for their name being associated with something that like killed many people, destroyed many people's livelihoods. We think it's better to name it after things that aren't also named after people. We don't think children name their, or we don't think people name their kids like Volvo or Shell or Exxon. So we don't think this is going to be an issue on our side of the house. So overall, we're like prioritizing people's mental health. Moving over to the to the Gov case. First they talk about like taking someone's name and switching a politician's name. We don't think this is going to work. If someone told us that like Hurricane Ida is now going to be called Hurricane Avery, everyone already thinks of it as Hurricane Ida. That's societally ingrained. That just won't work. So all of those harms do happen. First, on their thing about backlash, we say one, again, like cross-apply my case, politicians have lobbyists. They won't change their policies just because of backlash. Two, we think that a new politician will just get voted in if they leave. There is absolutely no reasoning as to why we would believe that this new politician would now be better about climate change. So if you believe the Gov's best case where a politician gets voted out of office, now a new politician gets voted in that hasn't been publicly shamed for being against climate change, nothing changes. This doesn't happen on our side of the house because companies don't get voted out of office. And then we say that again, it's like more impactful overall. Second, on the point about like discourse and changing opinions, they tell us that like it increases discourse. We think that it increases discourse more on our side of the house because more people care about Shell in the world than care about Mitch McConnell. And second, and just like cross-apply my responses there. And then on the point about recentering the topic, we think that we do this just as much. We're still naming it after things that are extremely relevant to people's everyday lives. For all of these reasons, I negate.
Okay, I think the leader of opposition for all court marks, and I call upon the member of government to deliver a speech not exceeding 8 minutes, 30-second grace.
Okay, awesome. If I cut out at any time during the speech, please just like raise your hand and like stop me. And with all of that, my time is going to start on my first word. So in 3, 2, 1. Now, okay, let's start straight off with op case, and then we're gonna go back into gov case kind of front line and go over the round as it looks right now. So the op counterfactual, like counterplan that was kind of given at the top of case was talking about like naming after corporations that are contributors instead of politicians. We have a few responses here. So like why this is like not gonna actually do as much as naming after politicians, but it's also just like not very effective at all. First of all, the idea that politicians rely on public opinion, which like directly like while specifically energy companies don't have any incentive. So we tell you that like for example, like they're like are a monopoly. Like people in America can't really choose where they're getting their energy or gas from. So it doesn't really matter when it comes to like specific like energy or gas companies who are also just insanely wealthy and don't actually care much like if this was to happen. But even beyond that, like let's say you buy that. Like, I have lots to get through. Let's say that you buy that, like, okay, fine, we're gonna name it after like someone that has like really bad shipping policy. Like, let's say we're gonna call a storm Amazon because they have like awful like emissions because of this. Let's see what the actual effects are of this. We would first argue is that like these big, large companies that are multi-billion-dollar companies that have been like, making a lot of money with these policies for years wouldn't actually face much backlash. People still like use them, and people still like have to like will buy from them regardless of it. And then even in the case that like they do like, okay, fine, let's say they change a few policies, we would argue that this wouldn't have a huge impact towards the whole all of climate change because marginally these companies are so small in like the larger scheme of like everything that contributes to climate change. Let's go into their C1, which is basically about like their counterplan. For four responses just on the like idea of like why this is just not actually going to be as effective. First, the idea that companies have more power and that like what we can have better practices and less pollution. First, no cross apply everything I just told you in response to the counterplan, but even beyond that, we would say like also people aren't going to like change where they buy from. We need to like consider the nuances into why a lot of these companies have like higher emissions. I think like one of the easiest ones to consider is like Amazon, which like is known for having like the notoriously low, like Shein, which is known for having notoriously low shipping costs and cost of their goods. These companies often have really, really low costs because they are able to like save money when it comes to shipping by like using things that are not great for the climate, as opposed to more sustainable brands, which have higher and higher prices because they are trying to like ship stuff a lot more sustainably, or they're like trying to like not like make a lot of products in like larger factories, which like decreases cost, but also increases emissions and effect on the environment. This means that people have to buy from these brands because they simply cannot afford to buy from other places. So fine, let's say you were go ahead and you name a storm Amazon. Maybe that would make, if you buy everything that like Ops tells you, that makes people in like some one small region stop like buying from Amazon. But I'm telling you that's not going to happen. People need to keep buying from these large brands because of the price of their goods. Like this is not going to happen. Third response here is that like for years there have been companies that have been like or lobbyists that have been going against these bigger organizations, and quite literally nothing has happened. Like they've like been pressuring, they've like been telling all the reasons why like they are really bad for the climate. People have not jumped on it. People are not going to because of this. Next response is that like politicians have the power to change votes on legislation. This is like uniquely why like politicians are a lot better to like stick their name on something than a company. Politicians can actively change policy. They can actually pass things such as like the Inflation Reduction Act. They can do a lot of things to try to actually like change the world and actually change emissions and make like tangible change. One company changing a policy or two, maybe decreasing emissions by like 0.5% while still trying to like maintain their margin lines, versus a politician like voting yes on a bill that they used to vote no on, that is actively going to go and make change in policy. And like climate change policy is a lot like of a bigger of an impact. Finally, we want to make the comparison that like on like what controls companies is not the people, it's the shareholders in these like private companies. And I think a great analogy for this is like the shareholders that control like big companies are alike to like the people that vote in like that vote in politicians. That is why it's super important for politicians to be liked by people, especially local politicians whose whole voting base is going to be in their region or in their state, which in a gov world has just been hit by a huge natural like disaster, of which their name is now on. So with that, let's go into their C2 on that companies are relevant for longer. 4 more responses here. We argue this is just not true. Companies don't have like responsibility to the whole world. People have been attacking companies with bad emissions for years. Second, I think also, for example, a great example here is like oil companies. Like they don't care because they make so much money, and also their fundamental business is like oil and drilling into the planet, which is awful when it comes to like climate change. But that is what they make so much money on, is a necessity for people in the world. They're going to keep making money on it regardless. Third is that like the shareholders of these companies could control them, and they're currently controlling them, knowing all of the bad effects on the world, and it's not changing it. And finally, 4, even if you buy this and you think that people will turn against these companies, it won't actually do anything. Like let's say that like a few companies like go to policies for like that are better for the climate. That versus like passing this huge piece of legislation that like maybe puts caps on like companies around the world is like a lot like is a lot better for gov on scope. So you're already preferring this argument. And finally, their C3. Yes.
How would any legislation be passed that capped emissions around the world, given that legislation can only be passed within a single country or region?
Well, I'm saying for a lot of like companies that could be operating that are American companies that operate around the world, for example, Amazon. But even beyond that, we would just say that like this legislation can also be like regional in America, which would also have an impact. On the third contention of how it's like hard to be named after hurricanes or a natural disaster, a few like responses here. First, just like first and last name solves. Like when Zach gave you a lot of examples of this, like they use terms such as like Joe Manchin, Rick Perry. It's not going to be like one name, but even beyond that, completely non-unique. Hurricanes are already named after people. And like it has the exact same impact. But even one more response here on non-uniqueness is that companies are also named after people. Just because my like opponents tell you Exxon or like T-Mobile, that doesn't mean that there are tons of companies that aren't named after actual people. So this is going to have an impact in either world. And we'd also just argue is like not that important for the round. Like people aren't going to be like actively bullied like on a large measure because of this. With that, let's go back into the gov case. Let's start just like on the idea of like framework. They said like that they said they think util, but like Zach clearly said to you that like what's best for climate change just makes a lot of sense. First of all, that is what they said, but also just like in like the context of what we're actually arguing for in like the motion. Second, on the idea that of like what this actually looks like, my opponent said like that you can't change someone's names and this wouldn't work as people would those as like the first one. We tell you that society would be used to like the changing names. They think that this only status quo because we don't change names of disasters. If every disaster gets his name changed like 2 or 3 times, everyone will be used to it. And on the C1 on backlash, we really only heard 2 responses, which kind of ignored every single piece of warranting on like a 3 sub-point contention. What do we hear? We first hear that they have lobbyists and therefore no backlash, and find that new politician gets voted on if they leave. First, on the idea of lobbyists, they need votes as opposed to companies, which only needs money. Votes need popular opinion. Like the money that like funds companies only needs to have shareholders who may have very other interests than like appeasing the public. On the idea of politicians getting voted out, we completely disagree because the constituents in that region have changed because it was named after a disaster that happened to their region. If your constituents all did now like have changed their opinion, they're not going to vote in another person with the same ideology. If anything, we would say that it's a lot more likely they're going to do a lot more research on that issue and vote in people that actually are going to make positive change on that. They also concede all of our specific warranting on how like the people that are specifically affected by like these storm in the areas, and the idea that like the 2 possible impacts of this are politicians changing their opinions and also like solving through actual policy. On C2 of discourse, we hear that like increased discourse more on the other side of the house as more people like care about like shell companies like Mitch McConnell. We tell this is incorrect because we target like politicians in the specific area, which means that like discourse is a lot more important, especially in that area. And also this is not response to the main point. People are really just like over climate change.
Point of clarification, stop time.
Increasing.
Sorry, you completely glitched out. Can you repeat the last like 10 seconds?
Yeah, what was the last thing you have in your flow?
Like that people will be more likely to do research because like the constituents in the region have changed and people will do more research on the new constituents. It was
okay, awesome. So that was the response to C1 on backlash. Oh, okay, yeah. So the third response there was that then they concedes the specific warrants of subpoint B of people affected by said storm, and also the 2 possible impacts of the politician changing opinion and adding policy. And then I started reading 2 responses to your response on our C2. The first response is that this is incorrect because we target politicians to the specific area, which means that discourse is more important in that area. And the second response was that non-response to the main point of that people are like over climate change, that they're over like the corporations are polluting, like that they don't really care about Shell and they care about the price. Okay, so this is where I was at. So
okay,
I have 4 seconds left, 40 seconds on Grace. So I'll start my time at 7:56. Is that people just don't really care about these large companies, but what do they care about? They care more about like the price, like that they pump for gas every single day. We need to actually consider what people in America actually care about. They completely dropped our C3 and like haven't addressed it yet. So we're gonna tell you like what this also does is recenter this topic and makes climate change we talked about a lot more even beyond discourse. Just actually having people like I can connect to an issue, like in like urge legislators to actually pass policy to like enact and to actually change an issue. All that, so proud to affirm.
Okay, thank you, MG, and now for Emma.
Okay, hi, I'm gonna talk now. I'm Zachary Yu. I'm talking for, who am I talking for? The opposition, that's who. Time starts now. Okay, so on a counterfactual, they'd say that, okay, they bring up a couple of points. 1, politicians rely on public opinion. Corporations also rely on public opinion, right? This is a non-unique point. We would also say that that public opinion is more immediately like noticeable in terms of the success of corporations than it is on politicians, right? Politicians, right, only have to be like voted in like once every like 4 years or whatever, right? Whereas corporations are constantly beholden to stockholders, and the stocks are constantly changing. They change every day, like they change like continuously. What we would say is that if there's a massive decline in corporate public opinion, you see that immediately, and the shareholders demand change immediately. If there's a massive decline in public opinion of like a guy who won't face re-election for another 2 years, like he doesn't really care right now. They say that people can't choose where they get their energy or gas from. We have 2 responses to this. 1, yeah, you can. There's many places to get gas. But also, like, you could take the bus, or you could bike, or you could walk, or you could buy an electric car. There are options within this scenario. 2, we're not specifically restricting this to gas companies. We specifically talk about, like, actually, I don't know if we talked about it, but anyway, we would say that this applies to, like, clothing companies. This applies to, like,
all major contributors.
Right. This applies to like, yeah, as we define all major contributors to climate change, right? And so this is just like, you know, this not the case in like most markets. Most markets do not operate on just like one big monopoly, right? They talk about how corporations have like just too much money to care about this. This is not true, right? This sort of doesn't understand how corporations work. Corporations, regardless of how wealthy they are beholden to their shareholders who would always like to make more profit. And so if profit margins go down, no matter how good they used to be, right? Everyone wants them to always be up, right? Sure.
You think that shareholders care more about profit margins than they would hypothetically care about the economy? And if that's true, why would the stock price drop at all?
What? I don't understand the comparative, because fundamentally the stock prices of a single company drop if public opinion shifts against that company and people stop buying from that company, right? I don't see the impact on the larger economy, and so I don't understand the comparative. People still, they say that people still want product. They say that people like won't, they say that there won't be that much backlash and people like still want products, right? They can get their products from other sources, right? We would say that people care more about other things than politicians, right? We would say that politics are on people's minds, like not as much as just consuming products are, right? So we would say that also boycotts to companies have a larger impact for that reason, right? You're more frequently interacting with corporations than you are with politicians, right? I am buying things more often than I am voting. Okay, on our first contention, they say that people won't change where they buy from. They say, think about Shein, right? Think about how, it's sort of just known that Shein has like, bad labor practices. First of all, I would say that this like isn't super known, right? I would say that, generally, if you're just someone who goes to the mall and shops, right, you don't necessarily know where your clothing is coming from, right? This is the same deal that they say about this is the same thing that they say about politicians, right? Politicians are not constantly in the news. They're not constantly publicizing all of their bad opinions. Shein is not constantly in the news, constantly publicizing all of its horrible working practices, right? Okay. We would say that this applies to politicians too. The point is about recentering discourse, which we still have. And then also we would say that, there are alternatives, right? They basically say people don't have alternatives, and they say Shein and Amazon. You don't need to buy from Shein or Amazon, right? You can go to a retailer in person, right? You can buy from a thrift store, whatever, right? Gov's entire case relies on the idea that people care more about their house getting destroyed than any other politician's beliefs, right? We say this is true, right? We say they will care more about their house getting destroyed than the cost of the t-shirt they buy from Shein. They will be willing to boycott a company to prevent their house going down, right? So they talk about how they say lobbyists have failed, right? Lobbyists are primarily funded by big corporations. So like, obviously, of course, lobbyists funded by like pro-climate nonprofits have less money and therefore less influence over politicians than like corporations do. Corporations don't get lobbied. Politicians do. They talk about how politicians change policy and therefore they have more impact. We would say that politicians, first of all, only change policy to affect the actions of corporations. So we're cutting at the middleman here. But we would also say that corporations have more direct unilateral power than like a senator, right? Than a politician. If you're a senator, you get one vote. If you're a company, you get to decide like your whole strategy of business, your whole policy. They talk about how shareholders won't care. Once again, this makes no sense. Shareholders absolutely care about the public opinion of their company, right? If your company is just now associated with like a massive disaster that like kills thousands of people, that's a bad thing. You care. On contention 2, they talk about how companies they talk about how companies don't have responsibility to the whole world. This is not a Brink impact, right? They talk about how you can pass legislation is like wider reaching, right? And basically that it will affect larger amounts of the world. We would say that this is not true. We'd say that corporate action is wider reaching because American legislation cannot regulate like companies' activities outside of America. And because, we can't really rely on like developing countries where a lot of big corporate climate impacts are happening to regulate climate change, because they've shown they won't in the past, right? We would say that the way to change this is actually through directly forcing the corporations to change it by like direct action, by boycotting, right? We would say that this is a much more feasible source of action. They say that even if people turn against the companies, nothing changes. We would say that this isn't true, right? Companies want to save face. They do things that my partner described, right, that don't get refuted, right? They make a large contribution to a charity that will do good work, right? They change their corporate policies somehow, right? This just like isn't true. The shareholders would like the company to be seen as good, right? So, okay. Moving on to the government case. Okay, so they talk about how, okay, so they talk about, we'll just rename the disaster. Society will get used to disasters changing names, and every disaster will have its name changed like 2 to 3 times. This takes away all of their offense. This takes away all of their impacts. If you change the name of a hurricane that happened 20 years ago 3 times, no one cares at all. Okay, on contention 1, they talk about how they talk about constituents, right? They talk about how constituents change fundamentally when this happens. We would say constituents don't change because people don't change their ideology, right? If I'm a red voter and if I'm a red voter and I see that an earthquake named after a red politician like destroys my house, like even if we buy that, I just totally disagree with them now on every climate change policy, right? That is a single issue I'm against them on, right? But I still ideologically align up with them more than I do with the Democrats, right? I still ideologically line up with them on every other policy, right? The constituents don't change, right? The way we see big change is actually through broader like demographics, is through companies that do is largely through companies that do business like nationally, right? They talk about okay, hang on. Oh, okay. And then there's not a lot here on this case. They talk about what? They talk about targeting policies. Sorry, no, I mean, there's not a lot of new material. They talk about targeting policies in a specific area, cross-apply what we have about targeting like targeting local corporations. We are just able to do this like if we target just like if we name it after like a local mining operation that has the same impact, and cross-apply everything we've said about how it has more direct impact to do it on a company than on a politician. And then they talk about John Koch. This is a point from their first speech, but I would like to go into this because this example basically about John Koch basically proves our point about how politicians are just tools to the corporations, and so corporations have more influence. John Koch has no ideology outside of what is good for his company, and he buys politicians to do what's good for his company, right? He is a corporate entity, who influences politics, right? Cut out the middleman, go towards the corporations. That's why you vote Bob.
Okay, thank you, Emma, and now Ella for 4 minutes 30. Grace.
Okay. Awesome. All right, so in this speech, I'm going to be going over the 3 biggest points in this round. 1, how much power do people have over corporations versus politicians? 2, how much power do politicians versus corporations have over climate change? And 3, what are the impacts of like increased discourse? So first, let's talk about how much power people have over corporations. So we tell you that like consumers have ultimate power over corporations because at the point where a small shift in like PR in corporations has been known to literally tank a corporation's stock prices, like public opinion is the ultimate factor. We also think, so the opposition's big argument here, or the government's big argument here, is that like people will not care so much about what the corporations like are doing because they care more about the prices. Let me just say the thing that my partner just said, which is like at the point where people's houses are literally getting destroyed and they're associating their house getting destroyed and their livelihoods getting destroyed with the impacts of this corporation, they are going to be prioritizing saving their house in the future over like buying t-shirts for a cheaper price. And then second, we tell you that like this applies on both sides of the house. If we don't believe that like if we don't believe that public opinion will change corporations, we also can't believe that public opinion will change enough that they would want to vote out the person who is currently representing them, despite the fact that, as my partner tells you, they still align with their representative on economic policy, on foreign relations, on like abortion, on literally every other policy. So moving over to politicians, the government claims that constituents' opinions will change and they will get voted out. 2 reasons we tell you this won't happen. 1, they're beholden to lobbyists. government never refutes this. At the point where politicians are beholden to the very corporations we are advocating for naming these disasters against, we don't think it ultimately matters. There is a reason why like lobbying is so bad in this country. It's because it stops policy from actually getting changed. And two, again, we don't actually see any change in the and in new people getting voted in. Gov says in their very first case that it is really important to shine a spotlight on politicians because right now, politicians' opinions on climate change are not widely known. We say this is true of future constituents or future politicians as well. Overall, new people will get voted in, nothing will change. Comparatively, on our side of the house, corporations are not beholden to other corporations. They are only beholden to their consumers. If their consumers stop liking them, they will change. Now, moving over to how much power politicians have over or versus corporations have over climate change. We say that corporations have direct control over climate change at the point where they can literally decide how to change their how to change how they run. Comparatively, politicians are just one person. Even if we buy that like every Republican in Congress suddenly becomes pro stopping climate change, which is hugely unlikely, we still see that every other country in the world still exists, right? So like there are so many politicians where this overall cannot change. Comparatively, Amazon makes a ginormous impact all by itself. It can change a lot all by itself. It doesn't need thousands of other people to agree with it to change. And then the second thing here is this point that I tell you in my first speech that has been completely dropped through government during this round, which is that even if you buy that corporations won't change any of their practices long term, overall, those corporations will still decide to do something to offset the bad PR, like making a multi-million-dollar donation to some organization that is helping stop climate change, that is giving humanitarian aid to people affected by climate change. This is completely conceded throughout this round. You have to buy this point, and therefore we should be winning just based off of this. And then so overall, we see that there will be more change happening on our side of the house. I strongly negate.
Okay, thank you for the final speech, PM.
All right, thank you so much. Is everyone ready? It's going to be a little bit all over the place, but I'm just going to try to signpost well. Okay. Time will start now. At the end of the round, I think that there's only a place to vote for the gov just because the ops path to the ballot is so muddled. In order for them to win, they need to prove that these corporations don't care about climate change right now, no matter how much backlash or public scrutiny they get. And they would the second their name goes on a disaster. But then I think it gets even more muddled when Zach throws away all of their counterplan offense when he utters the words, targeting small mining operations in a response on our case. This means that even if you buy everything they tell you, corporations, when they say, are not the Amazon and Shell they've been talking about the whole round. It's the small mining operations in the communities that's doing the local pollution. They don't even have a link into their bigger impacts because they threw it away. So what are we going to be talking about, and why is this not a valid path for them? Let's look at the corporations, and let's look at the arguments that go clean conceded. We tell you that fundamentally, consumers sometimes can't shift away from corporations because they don't have the choice. We hear a lot about Amazon, we hear a lot about Shein, and we say that people are just going to stop buying. But first off, I would say we mention oil companies and energy companies first and foremost. As a person living in New York City, we have to get our energy from Con Ed. There is no other choice. If a Con Ed hurricane hit New York, we don't change it. We have to stick through it. Second, we would say, what if you live in an area without many gas stations? You don't really get to choose which one you go to. That goes right back into the biggest argument in the round that they dropped, which is that consumers simply don't care about companies doing pollution or companies doing climate change. This was one of the most important points coming out of our case. It was consumers don't care when people are talking about companies polluting. They care about their price at the pump. When someone says energy, no one thinks of climate change and global warming. We think of the crisis and the price of living. We think of gas costing too much. That's what people think of. So even if you name hurricanes after companies, people don't care because they care about making it to tomorrow. I'm sorry, if it's between not buying a shirt and buying a shirt from Shein, you're buying a shirt from Shein. It's a really privileged argument to say that someone's not. Then talk about just impact in general. Who does more pollution? The United States Department of Defense or any individual company in the entire world? The answer is the DoD. Nora tells this to you beautifully when she says, even if you stop every emission from every company, it's still not enough because fundamentally the Department of Defense and the United States government is enough of a polluter. So why do we win this round? First, let's look at our third contention, which goes clean conceded. Look at your flow. There's not a single response written on it about shifting and refocusing the discourse. Not only is there not a single response, so this is where you should be prioritizing voting. This is already an a priori argument. Every other argument in the round talks about increasing discourse, making people think about climate change. This is the only argument that changes the way that people think about climate change. Care, and people don't care about these companies. However, when you start targeting people, people end up targeting climate change to the natural disasters that are wrecking their lives every single day. They tie it to the people that they vote for. I'm sorry. What if you cannot choose to buy a $4 shirt? You know what you can choose to do? Just cast your ballot for another person because it's free. There is no financial incentive. That's the biggest thing. Some people have to do environmentally unhealthy activities simply because they cannot afford to be eco-friendly. That is the biggest thing. So let's look at a few other places in this round about why.
Stop the time.
Yep.
The point that casting a ballot is free, as compared to like making a purchase, is a new argument and hasn't been brought up previously.
In our case,
I would say it's just. I would say it was one of our responses to your case at the very, very beginning. It was just that people can't choose to switch away from corporations because sometimes they don't have other options. It's just a logical extension of that. It's just implicating that onto our case instead of a response on yours. But I'll leave it up to judge discretion. Okay. So, I'm at 3:39. My time will continue now. Now, let's talk about the impact on public opinion that their arguments can even have in the first place if you give them that the public cares. The question is, do corporations care? And what we would answer is fundamentally no, because of the biggest thing that goes clean conceded, shareholders of dirty companies. If I buy a share in an oil company, I know that I'm buying a share in an oil company. I'm buying it because they're an oil company, and I know that I'm going to make profit because they're doing drilling. I personally, as a shareholder, am not pressuring that company to be cleaner because I'm buying it because it's unclean. Fundamentally, as opposed to people, they assume that the public opinion is the same as the financial opinion. When you're in financial markets, people care about profits over people. People care about profits over the environment, and people will keep on investing because that's all you need. However, if you look at a politician, they concede the biggest thing. They try to talk about how lobbying loses us the round. No, lobbying loses them the round because fundamentally we give you a response. We say even when there is lobbying, lobbying can only do so much insofar as politicians still need to be elected. That is the biggest thing. Votes to a politician is shareholders to a company. Votes to politician is dollars to a company. A company, however, needs to get dollars, and it doesn't matter where they get it from. They can get it from anywhere. They don't need public opinion. However, a politician is fundamentally bound to that. So at the end of this round, where's the cleanest place that you're going to be voting? First off, our clean conceded C3, and then fundamentally the change on the politicians, which is always going to be more effective than the change on companies. We agree that this obviously change is going to happen in some way or another, but on their side of the flow, we tell you is that people are going to be shouting in a void. Even if people do get mad, companies are not going to change to fix things, and even if they do change, there's no impact on climate change. Every single place in this round is going to be a clean vote for the Gov. So with my last breath, I asked you to cast your ballot for Trinity KF. Thank you.
Okay.
Good round.
Good round.
Go round.
Is it okay if I like refer to Zach you as Zachary because I think that was the name on the thing? Okay, cool. Just so not to be confused. Okay. So Zach Fleisler. I think yeah, there probably wasn't the clearest framework in the first speech, but I think like that one part of your plan didn't make that much sense, but like it honestly wasn't that important in the vote, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Like the fact that you would change the name, like I don't think that was like huge, but yeah, it didn't make too much sense, but I think you had like two really interesting points, like really creative points about like the effect or the subliminals. Like I think like, that was a good thing to bring into the round. Like it was used by both sides. I think you did a good job of warranting that. And yeah, again, I think the discourse point, again, is like a second thing. I think the discourse point was also like really creative, and I think it like ended up being really important in the decision. Amber, I think it was good that you put down a more concrete framework. And I don't know if the counterplan, like I immediately, like right away, like I wasn't sure like where the counterplan was going, but I think like you guys like did a good job of like bringing it in and like making it like actually different, because I was like worried that the round would become kind of homogenous if you guys both were kind of naming it after someone bad, but you did a good job of like separating those impacts, so that was good. I also think, yeah, the last point was really creative also, like about the names. Like I wouldn't have thought of that. Like that was really creative and that was really interesting. I wish you hadn't dropped it in weighing, but I'll talk about weighing later though. Okay. Nora, I think you had a good point about shareholders. I just think like overall, like you had some really good refutations. I think you addressed like almost everything that you needed to address, if not everything. But I do think the one thing was that you tried to grab like too big of a point there about constituents changing their mind about things. Like I think that was kind of like too too much of like an impact for like you to try to like take there, and I think that it ended up playing like a little, giving like op like a little bit of an entrance into like refuting that just for probability. Then Zachary, I think you had a good point. I think that shareholders like, you know, about like caring about profit, I think that was like a good way to refute that. And again, like I wish it became like more prevalent like in weighing, and like it's like brought in more that shareholders like, you know, they're probably like if the things go, if like the popularity of this company goes down, like they might pull out their shares or whatever. And but I don't think you interacted with like the overall top of case as much as you should have, like about like the corporations relying on public opinion, etc. Like you did interact with it, but I don't think that like it was I think it was like more of a counterclaim, just saying that like corporations also rely on public opinion. But I think it could have been like better to have like more direct clash between how politicians rely on them versus how corporations rely on them. I didn't understand Zach Fleisler's POI to you about the economy. So I wasn't really sure. I wasn't really sure what the question was. I have no comments on how you handled that, but I was just wanted to point that out. And I think your point about like when you said like, oh, like you can buy from thrift store, there's ultimately something else you could do with companies, like that's true. And I'm not saying that that's like a point that like should have been made, that like yes, there is something different that you can do. But I think the way you presented it, like it's not the problem isn't that like it's, you know, it's not like considering people's like circumstances, because I think like that kind of was a wash at the end of the round. But I think it was more so that like it requires people to make a change, like make a change in their lifestyle. And I think that's kind of a too high of an impact to try to go for in this round. I think like on both sides, just trying to argue that people are actually going to change their stances, like just like when I pointed out Nora's points about constituents changing their minds, I think it's just too high of an impact to try to get. So it didn't really flow to either side. And I think, yeah, okay. With that, here are all the voting issues. Okay, so I think discourse was to gov. I think it was conceded, and I think it was really important because op didn't have anything I could make a direct comparative to. There wasn't really anything on op that had like discussions of popular countries and like popular culture and how that impacts the environment. So I couldn't really put that as a comparative. So I automatically gave that part to gov. The shareholder debate, I think that also kind of flowed to gov because I think it was a little bit like dropped by op. Like I said, it wasn't really mentioned later, like that a refutation to shareholding. So I kind of just like I let that like I took that to gov. So, and also people changing their mind, like, again, I didn't think this was like super probable on either side, but it still to me flowed to gov because like, I think who like chooses to support like the company, like is probably like, I think less people will change their opinions on like whether or not they're going to support the company than people who will stop supporting a politician, for example. Just because I think there's too many companies and there's not enough politicians, but that's just my take. Okay. And then lobbying, that is something that I felt like flowed to op actually, like just because or lobbying and protesting, I guess, because I think that like ultimately that does affect companies more than it affects politicians. Just because like again, like it was mentioned, like politicians have like term limits. You only like get to like vote for like politicians like every certain amount of years, and like people are probably just going to forget about it by then. So I think like the protesting actually does affect the company more. So I think like I bought that, all those like points about like it happens like now, like it happens currently. So I bought that. And if change occurs, like I think that also flows to op, like the magnitude flows to op, because I think companies, like it was well explained like why like companies making a change is going to be more impactful on the environment than politicians making a change. But ultimately, despite everything, I still voted for gov because I think that while op is almost like able to grab some like pretty big impacts, it's intuitive that like and also gov does a good job explaining this, that like the impacts of either side of the house are pretty low in this debate. So I had to vote mostly on like this whole probability thing rather than like the potential magnitude just in case something happens. Like yes, companies based on this round, right, and based on and Gov's lack of reputation to this, like companies do have more of a stake in the environment, but I think like it lost because like all of the like wins of Gov over like how popular culture is going to actually affect things or not here, especially the discourse point. I think that was like not a good decision to drop that. Just like an example of that being like people are probably not going to stop buying from companies, but like it would make a bigger impact if everybody stopped like giving Shell money than it would if like people stopped voting for this one politician. Like I bought the point that it's just going to be a different politician with the same policies, but like I just didn't get enough. Like I don't think that weighed out as like the fact that that's actually going to happen. So I just think it lost some probability, which ended up being the most important for me. So it was 2-1 for op. So if Gov has any questions for me, you can ask. If not, we can move on to the next digits.
Okay, I'm happy to go. Yeah, so I voted for the opposition, and just going through like the overview of why I did that. Okay, so on this like idea of if like anyone will change their minds or their behaviors, opposition brought up like single issue voters and the idea that like people might pick other parts of their ideology over climate change. And then government kind of had the very kind of like sort of symmetrical point about how like people aren't necessarily going to change like their buying habits, or they might not have another option because of just like monopolies, the way that their lives are set up. So I saw at this point as like kind of symmetrical, but what I did by here is like the immediacy of boycotts. Whereas if a natural disaster occurs and like 2 years away from an election, people will likely get distracted. And I also thought that corporations are a much more direct impact. I agree that recentering the topic did flow to the government, but I didn't buy that it was like an insanely central argument. I just think that it was not super responded to, but it was also not like extended on super fully. It's not my flow, and not to the point where I would be willing to make it like the main voter issue in the round. I thought that like because other things took up such like a significantly larger portion of the round, it should be much more of a voting issue because I just had so much more of my flow over that. And then on like shareholders versus individuals, I did buy the government's point on that, but also just that was to me outweighed by the directness of lobbying, and then also like the size of a corporation and the opposition's point that like in the worst case scenario, like or not necessarily the worst case scenario, but like in like a throwaway action, a corporation can do more as like a throwaway PR action than a politician can. And yeah, I just thought that I thought it was much clearer to understand how corporations could impact this. And so I thought that just like based on probability, they really wanted probability to me. And I definitely agree with Eva that like it's because the impacts are so small, you kind of have to go on probability.
So I can add the comments on yeah, it was basically pretty much addressed by Isabel, but even though I thought like refuted a lot of points and like impacted more on whereas op didn't really like respond to the C3, and yeah, but overall I felt like those impacts and the refuted claims out like by government was like still not enough to kind of outweigh the possibility of just consumer just the cooperation and just people being more swayed by these companies than they will be swayed by politicians, as Isabel said before. Yeah, also for C3, I didn't really yeah see have major impacts for government side about like recentering discourse. It was creative, but like I didn't think it was a major issue, so I still voted for op. And wait, let me just look through what else do I also have. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Also, I just thought that more immediacy and like just overall, even if the companies like care more about the profit and like the like shareholder like impacts, I felt like just because of like time frame, like for 4 years until the next election, and having just another like people to replace that politician, and like overall not leading to a significant impact. This is why I voted for all.
Good round, everyone. Thank you guys for judging.